The final utility shutoff notice arrived on the same morning his 7-year-old daughter asked if they'd have to sleep in the car again, her voice carrying the kind of careful steadiness children develop when they've learned that asking about basic needs makes adults cry. Matthew Cole stood in the kitchen of the apartment they'd be evicted from in 17 days, holding a paper that confirmed the electricity would be cut tomorrow, and looked at his daughter Emma eating dry cereal because the milk had run out and he wouldn't have money for groceries until a paycheck that might not come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The apartment was already mostly bare, furniture sold piece by piece over the past 8 months to cover rent after the warehouse where Matthew had worked closed without warning. The walls showed rectangles where pictures used to hang, shadows of a life that had included his wife before she'd decided that poverty wasn't what she'd signed up for and had left with a man who owned a successful car dealership. The divorce papers had arrived the same week Matthew lost his job, as if Rebecca had been waiting for confirmation that he'd failed before making her exit official. Emma hadn't cried when her mother left. She'd just gone very quiet, had stopped asking when mommy was coming back, had developed the habit of organizing her few remaining possessions in neat rows so they'd be ready when they had to move again. Matthew saw his failure reflected in his daughter's careful neutrality, in the way she'd learned at 7 years old to make herself small and undemanding. "We'll figure something out," he said, the words automatic and empty. He'd been saying them for months, since the eviction notice, since the truck's engine had seized up and he couldn't afford repairs, since the temp agency stopped calling with day labor jobs. They were down to $380, the last remnants of what he'd saved before everything collapsed. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, Matthew sat in the public library where the heating was free and his dying laptop could charge without adding to bills he couldn't pay. He was searching rental listings that might as well have been descriptions of mansions for all the chance he had of affording them when an advertisement caught his eye, different from the housing posts, stranger. County foreclosure auction, industrial property with historic designation. Riverside Cotton Mill, 5. 2 acres including main processing building and worker housing. Minimum bid $400. Property sold as is, extensive structural damage, buyer assumes all environmental and safety liabilities. The photographs showed a massive brick structure that looked like it had been dying slowly since the 1970s, for stories of broken windows and collapsed sections, its smokestack cracked and leaning at an angle that suggested eventual collapse. The mill sat on the edge of Grantville, a town Matthew had driven through once, a place that had the exhausted quality of communities built around single industries that had moved overseas. According to the county records, the Riverside Cotton Mill had been built in 1889 by a family named Pritchard, had employed 300 workers at its peak, had processed cotton into fabric and thread for nearly 80 years before automation and foreign competition made it obsolete. The last Pritchard to run it had been someone named Walter, who'd kept the mill operating through the 60s by specializing in high-quality cotton goods for a shrinking market of buyers who valued American manufacturing. The mill had closed in 1971. Walter Pritchard had died in 1973, and the property had sat abandoned for over 50 years, accumulating structural damage and environmental citations that made it untouchable for conventional development. The auction was scheduled for the next morning. Matthew clicked through the environmental reports, finding language about asbestos and lead paint and machinery that hadn't been properly decommissioned. The building was a liability masquerading as property, the kind of thing only a fool would bid on. But $400 was less than 2 weeks' rent on apartments he couldn't afford, and at least it was a roof and walls, space that would be legally his even if it was falling apart. It was desperation making him consider this, the kind of thinking that came from having a 7-year-old daughter and 17 days until homelessness. But the alternative was sleeping in a car he didn't own anymore, or a shelter where they'd be separated, or watching Emma's careful steadiness crack when she realized her father couldn't provide even the most basic security. He spent the evening researching the Pritchard family and their mill, finding old newspaper articles about Walter Pritchard's refusal to modernize, his insistence on quality over profit, his eventual bankruptcy when cheaper imports made his traditional methods uncompetitive. One article from 1972 mentioned Walter's mysterious death, found in the mill under circumstances that were never fully explained, ruled natural causes though he'd been only 68 and in apparent good health. The article included a photograph of Walter standing in front of the mill in what must have been the 1960s, a lean man with work-scarred hands and the kind of posture that suggested pride in what he'd built. Behind him, barely visible, was part of the mill's interior, massive looms and processing equipment that represented an era when American textile manufacturing had been viable. The auction happened in a courthouse basement that smelled of mildew and old documents, maybe 10 people scattered across metal folding chairs. Most looked like scrappers or investors, people who knew exactly what metal and brick were worth when buildings were torn down for salvage. Matthew sat in the back with Emma, who'd insisted on coming after he'd explained they might be bidding on a building that could become their home. The auctioneer worked through properties with the tired efficiency of someone who'd sold hundreds of foreclosed buildings, abandoned houses, and commercial lots nobody wanted. When the Riverside cotton mill came up, his voice took on a warning tone that suggested he'd done this before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Property requires extensive repair and meets historic preservation criteria limiting renovation options. Structural engineering assessment recommended before occupation. Environmental hazards documented in county reports. Minimum bid $400. Matthew raised his hand, his heart hammering hard enough that Emma grabbed his arm with both her small hands. $400 from bidder 22. Do I hear $425? Silence filled the basement. Matthew felt eyes turning toward him, sensed the assessment of people who recognized desperation when they saw it and wondered what kind of fool bid on a building that everyone with sense avoided. Going once at $400. The auctioneer scanned the room with professional thoroughness. Going twice. Matthew waited for reality to intervene, for someone to save him from his own desperation by outbidding him, for the universe to prevent what felt like either the worst decision of his life or the only decision left. Sold to bidder 22 for $400. Emma's grip on his arm tightened. Dad, we bought a building? Yeah, sweetheart, Matthew said, his voice not quite steady. We bought a building. At the county clerk's office, he counted out $400 in 20s he'd been keeping for their last rent payment, then added 40 more for transfer fees and processing costs. The clerk, an older woman named Dorothy who looked like she'd processed 1,000 similar transactions, slid the deed across the counter with a long look that suggested she'd seen this particular kind of desperation before. The Pritchard place, she said, not quite a question. Yes, ma'am. Dorothy leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice though the office was empty except for them. My mother worked there in the 50s. Said Walter Pritchard was exacting but fair, paid better than most mill owners and treated workers like people rather than machinery. The mill had a reputation though. What kind of reputation? Walter was secretive about certain parts of the operation. Kept sections of the mill locked, didn't allow workers in specific areas even during full production. Some people thought he was hiding outdated equipment he couldn't afford to replace. Others figured he was protecting trade secrets, special processes that gave his cotton goods the quality that kept him competitive longer than other mills. Is it safe? For my daughter? Dorothy's expression softened, seeing Emma waiting patiently near the door. Structurally, I can't say without inspection. But the environmental hazards are real: asbestos insulation, lead paint, old machinery that was never properly shut down. You'd need to be careful about what areas you occupy. She hesitated. My nephew does building inspections. His card's in the information packet. You'll want someone to tell you what you're actually dealing with before you move in. The drive to the mill took them through Grantville's Main Street, past storefronts that showed a pattern Matthew recognized from other towns built around single industries, half the businesses closed, the ones remaining showing the strain of an economy that had moved on and left people behind. The town had the faded quality of a photograph left too long in sunlight, its best days visible only in the bones of what remained. The mill sat where Riverside Road met the Grantville River, a massive structure that dominated the landscape like a cathedral to industry. For stories of dark brick with hundreds of windows, most broken or boarded, a smokestack rising beside it like a broken finger pointing at nothing. The scale was overwhelming, the kind of building designed when labor was cheap and manufacturing happened in America and communities grew around factories that promised stability for generations. Up close, the decay was more evident. Sections of roof had collapsed inward, leaving gaps that exposed timber framing to decades of weather. The loading dock where cotton bales had once been delivered had rotted through, its timbers collapsed into jumbled piles. Graffiti covered the lower walls, layers of tags and messages that suggested generations of trespassers had used the abandoned building for purposes Walter Pritchard never intended. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate hung open, its lock cut away years ago. Matthew parked his borrowed truck in what had been a delivery area, looking at what he'd purchased with money that should have kept them housed for 2 more weeks. "It's really big," Emma said quietly, her earlier excitement tempered by the reality of what they were looking at. "Too big for us to use most of it. But we'll find a space that's safe, make it work until we figure out what comes next." They approached the main entrance carefully, stepping over broken brick and rusted metal that littered the ground. The door was secured with a newer padlock, and the key Dorothy had given Matthew turned smoothly despite everything else's decay, suggesting the county had maintained minimal security even while the building fell apart. Inside, the mill was vast beyond anything Matthew had imagined. The main processing floor stretched out like a football field, 2 stories of open space beneath a ceiling supported by iron beams and brick arches. Rows of massive looms stood silent, their mechanisms frozen mid-operation as if workers had simply walked away one day and never returned. Cotton dust still coated everything, a white film over machinery and floors and walls, the ghostly residue of an industry that had moved on. The smell hit him immediately, cotton and mildew and something industrial he couldn't identify, the accumulated scent of 50 years of abandonment. Light filtered through broken windows and holes in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air with the same pattern they'd probably danced for decades. Emma stayed close, her hand finding his, both of them processing the scale of what Matthew had committed them to. The mill felt more like exploring a tomb than inspecting property, every surface holding the weight of history and loss and the slow death of American manufacturing. "There's stairs," Emma said, pointing to a metal staircase that climbed to upper floors. "We'll check them carefully. Buildings this old, you can't trust everything is still safe." They climbed slowly, Matthew testing each step before letting Emma follow. The second floor held what appeared to be administrative offices and quality control rooms, spaces where the business side of textile manufacturing had happened. Most rooms were empty except for debris and the evidence of water damage from the roof failures above. One office was larger than the others, with windows overlooking the processing floor. A desk remained, its surface warped by moisture but intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall, most of them hanging open and empty. A framed photograph hung on the wall, showing the mill in operation, workers at their stations, fabric moving through looms and patterns that represented wages and livelihoods in community. Behind the desk, partially obscured by a fallen section of ceiling tile, Matthew noticed something odd about the wall. A seam in the brickwork that didn't match the rest of the construction, vertical lines that suggested a doorway that had been bricked over and then plastered to hide the fact it had ever existed. He pulled away more of the fallen ceiling material, revealing more of the hidden doorframe. This wasn't casual renovation. Someone had deliberately sealed a door and then concealed the ceiling so thoroughly that only structural damage had revealed it. "Dad, what is that?" Emma's voice carried curiosity rather than fear. Matthew ran his fingers along the seam, feeling where mortar had been applied to brick that didn't match the surrounding wall. Walter Pritchard had locked sections of the mill, Dorothy had said. Had kept areas off limits even to workers. Because he was hiding something he didn't want found. "Help me clear this debris." Together they pulled away fallen tiles and plaster, revealing a doorway that had been sealed with newer brick than the rest of the building. The mortar between bricks was different too, applied more recently, probably in the 1970s when Walter was preparing to close the mill permanently. Matthew examined the wall, finding that one section of newer brick had been mortared less thoroughly than the rest, as if someone had wanted to maintain the possibility of access even while hiding the door. He used a metal rod from the debris to pry at the loose bricks, and after several minutes of careful work, managed to create an opening large enough to see through. Cool air emerged from the gap, carrying a scent different from the mill's cotton dust and decay. Something clean and almost metallic, like air that had been sealed away from the building's slow collapse. Matthew pulled out his phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam revealed not another office or storage room but a narrow passageway descending into the building's foundation, stone steps leading down into darkness. "Stay here while I check it out," he told Emma. "No way. We're exploring together." Matthew wanted to argue, but he recognized the determination in his daughter's face, the same stubborn insistence on facing things together that had gotten them through the past 8 months. "Right behind me then. If I say stop, you stop." They descended carefully, the stone steps solid despite their age. The passage led down approximately 20 feet before opening into a chamber that made Matthew's breath catch. The space was maybe 15 feet square, the walls lined with brick, the ceiling supported by stone arches that suggested serious construction. Unlike the mill above, this room showed no signs of water damage or decay. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, and on those shelves sat hundreds of leather-bound ledgers, each labeled with dates ranging from 1889 through 1971. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made Matthew's hands start shaking. Wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked carefully and marked with stenciled labels. U.S. gold coin, $20 double eagles, 1889 to 1933. Each crate had additional markings indicating quantities and dates, and a brass plate affixed to the largest crate bore an inscription. "Walter Pritchard, Master Weaver. What remains when markets fail and banks betray trust." Emma squeezed Matthew's arm. "Dad, is that treasure?" "I don't know what it is," Matthew said honestly, though his racing heart suggested exactly what it might be. "But we need to be very careful about this." He approached the nearest crate carefully, finding it sealed but not locked. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had protected them for decades, were gold coins. $20 double eagles, each one bearing dates from before 1933, each one representing wealth beyond anything Matthew had seen outside museums. He opened another crate. More coins, these from an earlier era, their designs slightly different but their gold content unmistakable. A third crate held paper currency, old bills wrapped in oilcloth, denominations he'd never seen in circulation. Matthew sat on the cold stone floor, surrounded by more wealth than he'd earned in several lifetimes of construction work, trying to process what this meant. Walter Pritchard had converted his fortune to gold and cash before the mill closed, had hidden it in this chamber, and had died before retrieving it or telling anyone where it was. For 50 years, a fortune in gold had sat beneath a building nobody wanted, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed textile mill at auction for $440. As Matthew's flashlight played across the chamber, illuminating crate after crate of what might be millions in gold coins and currency, Emma found something else. A metal box on one of the shelves, smaller than the crates, with a note taped to its lid. Matthew opened it carefully, finding inside a letter written in precise handwriting on paper that had yellowed with age. "To whoever finds this chamber, the gold represents 50 years of profit from honest work, saved against the day when American manufacturing would no longer be viable. The banks failed us in 1929. The markets failed us in the 60s. Foreign competition has finally succeeded where those failures did not. This gold is my insurance against total loss, my provision for whatever comes after the mill closes. If you found this place, you've proven yourself thorough enough to deserve what I've left. The combination to the main vault is the year this mill opened, followed by the year I was born. The key is buried where all good cotton begins, in the soil beneath the magnolia that has stood longest. Use this wealth better than I did. I hoarded when I should have invested in people. Learn from my mistake." Walter Pritchard, March 1971. Matthew stood in the hidden chamber holding a letter from a dead man, looking at wealth that could solve every problem he faced, feeling the weight of discovery and possibility pressed down on shoulders already carrying more than they could bear. Above them, the textile mill creaked in the wind, its vast spaces holding secrets Walter Pritchard had died protecting. The building Matthew had purchased for $440 of money he couldn't spare had just revealed itself to be something far more complicated than an abandoned industrial ruin. And whatever waited in the vault Walter mentioned, whatever additional fortune the cotton magnate had sealed away, was about to become Matthew and Emma's to claim or their burden to carry forward. The chamber waited in silence, its secrets kept for half a century, patient as only buried things can be. Matthew's first instinct was pure protection. He pulled Emma back toward the chamber's entrance, his mind racing through implications he was trying not to count on. Walter Pritchard had died in 1973, which meant this gold had been sitting here for over 50 years, waiting. The crates represented wealth beyond anything Matthew had imagined, but they also represented complications he didn't understand yet. "We don't tell anyone about this," he said, kneeling to meet Emma's eyes. "Not until I figure out what we're dealing with. Understand?" Emma nodded, her expression serious. "Because people might try to take it? Because I don't know who has a legal claim to it, whether we're allowed to keep it, what finding treasure like this means." Matthew pulled out his phone, photographing the chamber, the crates, Walter's letter. "Documentation first, decisions later. But yes, also because people might try to take it." They climbed back to the mill's second floor, Matthew carefully repositioning the bricks to seal the opening they'd made. His hands shook slightly as he worked, adrenaline and possibility warring with caution learned from months of barely surviving. Finding gold didn't mean keeping gold, didn't mean their problems were solved. It meant new complications, new risks, new ways for desperate hope to be crushed by reality. After dropping Emma at school the next morning, Matthew drove to the county library and spent hours researching treasure trove law, property rights, estate settlements. What he learned was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Property found on land you owned legally generally belonged to you, but gold from before 1933 had numismatic value that attracted attention from collectors, historians, and opportunists who'd claim they deserved shares. Walter Pritchard's estate had been settled in 1974. If the gold hadn't been listed in estate records, it had either been hidden deliberately or the executor had failed to find it. Either way, enough time had passed that estate claims would be difficult to pursue. But difficult wasn't the same as impossible, and Matthew had no money for lawyers if someone decided to fight. He was researching numismatic appraisers when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional, female, polite in a way that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. "Mr. Cole, this is Jennifer Morrison from Morrison Development Group. I understand you purchased the Riverside Cotton Mill at yesterday's auction. I'd like to discuss a business proposition that might interest you." Matthew felt his stomach tighten. One day. He'd owned the mill for exactly one day, and already someone was calling with offers. "What kind of proposition?" "We specialize in historic building redevelopment. I'm prepared to offer you $15,000 for the property, cash transfer within 2 weeks. You'd walk away with a substantial profit and avoid the headaches of dealing with structural issues and environmental cleanup." $15,000. A week ago, that would have seemed like salvation. Even now, it represented security Matthew hadn't had in months. But the timing was too convenient, the offer too specific. Morrison Development had been waiting for someone to buy the mill, had probably been monitoring auction listings. "Why do you want it?" Matthew asked. "The location has development potential. The building itself is too damaged to salvage, but the riverside land could support mixed-use construction once environmental remediation is complete. We see opportunity where others see liability. And you're offering $15,000 for property you plan to demolish and redevelop into something worth substantially more?" Jennifer's pause was calculated. "We're offering a fair price for property with significant liabilities. The environmental cleanup alone will cost hundreds of thousands. The building is structurally unsound. You bought it for $400, Mr. Cole. We're offering you a 37-fold return on your investment. That seems generous. Let me think about it. You have 48 hours. After that, we move on to other opportunities and you're left with a building that's literally falling apart around you." After hanging up, Matthew sat in his borrowed truck in the library parking lot, staring at the mill across the river. Someone wanted this property badly enough to make an immediate offer, to pressure a quick decision. They either knew about the gold or suspected something valuable was hidden in the building. Either way, accepting their offer meant surrendering whatever Walter Pritchard had left behind. He picked up Emma from school, her face showing the kind of careful control that meant something had happened. She waited until they were in the truck before speaking. "Some kids said their parents are talking about you. About how you bought the old mill and must be crazy or desperate. One boy said his dad works for a development company and they were going to get the mill cheap from whoever was dumb enough to buy it first." Matthew's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Morrison Development? I don't know." But he said it loud enough that everyone heard. Said his dad always gets what he wants because he knows how to pressure people who don't have lawyers. The threat was barely veiled, delivered through a child to Matthew's child, letting him know that refusing Morrison's offer would have consequences. Small-town pressure, the kind applied by people who controlled enough of the local economy to make life difficult for those who didn't cooperate. That evening, after Emma had gone to sleep in the small safe area Matthew had created in Walter's old office, he descended alone to the hidden chamber. Walter's letter had mentioned a vault, combination based on the mill's opening year and Walter's birth year. Matthew had found Walter's birth year in the old newspaper articles, 1905. The mill had opened in 1889. He examined the chamber more carefully, finding what he'd missed in his initial shock, a section of the brick wall that wasn't quite flush with the rest. When he pressed on it, a portion of wall swung inward with the grinding sound of a mechanism that hadn't moved in decades. Behind the false wall was a vault door, heavy steel with a combination lock. Matthew turned the dial carefully. Right to 18, left to 89, right to 19, left to 05. The lock mechanism clicked with surprising smoothness, suggesting Walter had maintained it even as everything else decayed. Inside the vault were more crates, these marked differently than the gold coins. U.S. currency, pre-1963 silver certificates. And beneath those, something that made Matthew's breath catch, bearer bonds. Millions of dollars in bearer bonds from corporations that still existed, financial instruments that could be redeemed by whoever possessed them. Walter Pritchard hadn't just hidden gold. He'd hidden a fortune in multiple forms, diversified assets that represented decades of profit from textile manufacturing. Matthew's hands shook as he photographed everything, documenting wealth that dwarfed the $15,000 Morrison Development had offered. The next morning, Matthew called Gerald Porter, explaining what he'd found without revealing the full extent. Gerald listened carefully, asked detailed questions, and finally gave advice that made Matthew's situation clear. You need professional appraisals before you touch anything. You need legal documentation of the find and its location. Most importantly, you need to decide whether you're keeping the property or selling it, because if you sell without disclosing what you found, that's fraud. But if you disclose before selling, Morrison will know you found something valuable and will either withdraw their offer or increase pressure. What would you do? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I'd keep it. Not because of the treasure, though that's obviously significant, but because people who pressure quick sales of properties they claim are worthless usually know those properties are valuable. Walter Pritchard spent his life building that mill. He hid his fortune there for a reason. If you sell now, you're letting Morrison Development take what he protected. After hanging up, Matthew stood in the mill's vast processing floor, looking at machinery that had been silent for 50 years, thinking about Walter's letter. I hoarded when I should have invested in people. The cotton magnate had died alone, his skills untaught, his knowledge buried with him. He'd hidden his wealth instead of using it, and Matthew was being given the chance to correct that mistake. But making that choice meant fighting Morrison Development, meant standing up to people with resources and local connections, meant risking everything on the bet that legal ownership would protect him from the kind of pressure they could apply. Jennifer Morrison called that afternoon, her voice carrying an edge it hadn't held before. Mr. Cole, our 48-hour window closes in 6 hours. I need your answer. I'm declining your offer. The mill isn't for sale. The pause that followed felt heavy with calculation. That's unfortunate. You should know that Morrison Development has significant interests in Grantville. We employ contractors, sit on planning boards, have relationships with inspectors and code enforcement. Owning that mill is going to be much more complicated than you realize. Is that a threat? It's reality. Buildings that old require constant inspection. Environmental regulations are strictly enforced. Safety violations can result in condemnation. I'm simply pointing out that cooperation is usually easier than confrontation. I'll take my chances with confrontation. After she hung up, Matthew felt the weight of what he'd just committed them to. He'd declared war on people who controlled much of Grantville's economy, who could make his life difficult in ways he was only beginning to understand. But Emma had been watching from the doorway, had heard him refuse to be intimidated, and the pride in her expression made the risk feel necessary. "You told them no," she said. "I told them no. Because Mr. Pritchard's treasure is ours, and they're trying to steal it? Because some things are worth fighting for even when the fight is scary. Mr. Pritchard protected this place his whole life. The least we can do is protect it for a little while longer." The pressure started within days. Building inspectors appeared unannounced, citing violations that required immediate remediation. The county sent notices about environmental assessments needed before the property could be occupied. Local contractors who'd initially seemed willing to help with repairs suddenly had full schedules and couldn't take on new projects. Matthew recognized the pattern: systematic pressure designed to make ownership so difficult he'd sell just for peace. But he also had resources now that he'd been willing to use sparingly. He hired lawyers who specialized in property rights and historic preservation. He brought in independent inspectors who documented that many of the cited violations were exaggerated or outright fabricated. Most importantly, he started researching Morrison Development and found a pattern. They'd acquired multiple historic properties in the region, always from desperate owners, always just before those properties were condemned or foreclosed. Buildings that should have been preserved had been demolished and replaced with generic development that maximized profit while erasing local heritage. The confrontation came 3 weeks after Matthew had refused Morrison's offer. Jennifer Morrison appeared at the mill with 2 men Matthew didn't recognize, her professional politeness replaced by open hostility. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Cole. We've been patient, but our patience has limits." Matthew had prepared for this, had his phone recording, had notified Gerald Porter that he expected confrontation. "You've been harassing me with fabricated code violations and pressuring local contractors not to work with me. That's not patience, that's illegal intimidation. Prove it." Jennifer's smile was cold. "Small towns work on relationships. We have them, you don't. No one will testify that we pressured them, and by the time you navigate the legal system, you'll be buried in fines and condemnation orders." One of the men with her stepped forward, his posture suggesting he was used to intimidating people physically. "Buildings this old have accidents. Fires, structural collapses, unfortunate incidents that make properties worthless. Be a shame if something happened while your daughter was here." The threat against Emma made Matthew's vision narrow with rage, but he forced himself to stay calm, to let the recording capture every word. "You just threatened a child on camera. That's a felony in this state." Jennifer's expression flickered with uncertainty. "We're leaving. But you should think carefully about your next moves. This town belongs to people who've been here for generations, not outsiders who stumble in thinking they've found something valuable." After they left, Matthew stood shaking with adrenaline and fury, knowing he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Morrison Development had revealed themselves willing to threaten violence, which meant they either knew about the treasure or suspected enough to make them dangerous. He called Gerald immediately, sent the recording, and within hours had lawyers filing restraining orders and criminal complaints. The response was swift. Morrison Development claimed the threat had been misunderstood, that they were simply warning about the building's inherent dangers, that Matthew was a newcomer trying to extort them with false allegations. The battle moved to the courts and public opinion. Matthew found unexpected allies in historic preservation groups who'd been fighting Morrison's demolition practices for years. Local newspapers picked up the story, framing it as outside developers pressuring a desperate single father. The recording of the threat against Emma particularly outraged people, creating backlash Morrison hadn't anticipated. But the pressure on Matthew personally intensified. His borrowed truck's tires were slashed. Supplies he'd ordered for mill repairs were mysteriously lost in transit. Emma started having nightmares about the building burning down, her careful stoicism cracking under the weight of threats she was too young to have to process. One night, after comforting Emma back to sleep, Matthew sat in Walter's office reading the cotton magnate's letter again. "Use this wealth better than I did." Walter had hoarded his fortune, had died protecting it without ever using it to build something meaningful. Now Matthew was fighting to keep that fortune, but for what? To convert it to money and build a comfortable life somewhere else? Or to honor the trust Walter had placed in whoever found his hidden chamber? The next morning, Matthew made a decision that surprised even Gerald. He filed paperwork declaring the treasure find officially, working with appraisers to document everything, paying the substantial taxes that treasure trove income required. The process made the find public record, which meant Morrison Development would know what he'd found, but it also established clear legal ownership that would be harder to challenge. "You're giving up the element of surprise," Gerald warned. "They'll know exactly what they're fighting for now." They already knew, or suspected enough to matter. But this way, everything's documented and legal. They can't claim I'm hiding assets or trying to defraud anyone. The fortune is mine because I bought the property legally and found what Walter left for whoever was thorough enough to discover it. The public declaration of the find created the media attention Matthew had expected and dreaded. National news picked up the story: desperate single father buys foreclosed mill, finds cotton magnate's hidden fortune. The narrative was irresistible, and suddenly Matthew was fielding interview requests and dealing with attention that made his skin crawl. But the attention also provided protection. Morrison Development's harassment became harder to hide when national media was watching. Their influence in Grantville meant less when outside observers were documenting their pressure tactics. The confrontation shifted from backroom intimidation to public legal battles they were less equipped to win. Jennifer Morrison made one final approach, appearing at the mill alone, her hostility replaced by calculated respect. "I underestimated you, Mr. Cole. You've played this smarter than I expected." "I didn't play anything. I just refused to be pushed around by people who wanted to steal what wasn't theirs. We're prepared to make a final offer. $5 million for the property and all contents. You walk away wealthy, we get the location we want, everyone benefits. $5 million. Life-changing money, security beyond anything Matthew had imagined. He thought about Emma's nightmares, about the months of pressure and harassment, about how easy it would be to take the money and disappear to somewhere simpler. But he also thought about Walter Pritchard dying alone, his fortune buried and unused, his skills untaught, his building abandoned and forgotten. About the pattern of Morrison demolishing historic structures for profit. About the principle that some things were worth protecting even when powerful people wanted to destroy them. "No," Matthew said. "The mill's not for sale. Not for $5 million, not for $50 million. Because it's not about the money anymore. It's about refusing to let people like you erase history because it's more profitable than preserving it." Jennifer studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, not respect exactly, but recognition that she'd lost this particular fight. "You'll regret this. That building will bleed you dry with maintenance and restoration costs. You'll spend Walter Pritchard's fortune just keeping the roof from collapsing. Maybe. But at least I'll have spent it on something that matters instead of watching you tear it down and build something generic and forgettable." After she left, Matthew stood in the mill's processing floor, looking at decades of accumulated decay, understanding fully what he'd committed himself to. The treasure was real, was his legally, but using it to restore this massive building would consume years and millions. It would be easier to sell, to take Morrison's money and start fresh somewhere else. But easy paths didn't lead anywhere worth going. Walter Pritchard had taught him that through 50 years of patient waiting, through treasure hidden and trust placed in whoever would be worthy of finding it. The mill represented something beyond personal salvation. It represented the principle that heritage mattered, that history deserved protection, that knowledge was worth preserving even when economics said otherwise. Emma found him there as evening light filtered through broken windows. "Are we staying? Really staying?" Matthew pulled his daughter close, feeling her small frame against him, knowing his choice would shape her understanding of what mattered in life. "Yeah, we're staying. We're going to restore this mill and make it mean something again. It won't be easy, and people will think we're crazy, but sometimes the right choice is the hard one. Like Mr. Pritchard choosing to hide his treasure instead of selling the mill when things got bad. Exactly like that. He believed this place was worth protecting, even if it cost him everything. We're going to prove he was right." The mill stood around them in the gathering darkness, its vast spaces holding secrets that had finally been revealed, its future now dependent on whether Matthew could honor the trust a dead man had placed in whoever found what he'd hidden. The battle with Morrison Development had been won, but the real work was just beginning, transforming found treasure into preserved heritage, converting gold into knowledge, using wealth to build something that would outlast them all. The lawyer's name was Gerald Porter, and he'd been practicing in the county for 40 years, long enough to know the difference between legitimate treasure and legal complications. He examined Matthew's documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood that found gold attracted attention from people who believed they had claims to it. Walter Pritchard's estate was settled in 1974, Gerald said, spreading papers across his desk. All debts paid, all assets supposedly liquidated. The gold you found was never listed in estate records, which means either it was hidden deliberately before death or the executor failed in their fiduciary duty to locate all assets. Matthew felt tension coil in his chest. So someone could claim it should have gone through the estate? They could try. But the statute of limitations on estate claims is long expired. The property transferred to you legally through the foreclosure auction, and anything contained on that property belongs to the new owner unless specifically excluded. Gerald leaned back in his chair. However, there's a complication. Gold coins from before 1933 have numismatic value beyond their gold content. Some of what you found could be worth substantially more than melt value, which means you're looking at potentially significant wealth. How significant? Conservatively? If those crates contain what you've documented, you're looking at $20 to $30 million, possibly more depending on coin conditions and rarity. Gerald paused, letting that sink in. That kind of money attracts attention. People who claim Walter Pritchard owed their families money, opportunists who'll file frivolous lawsuits hoping for settlements, local authorities who'll question whether you're reporting it properly. Matthew thought about the 17 days until eviction, about Emma eating dry cereal because milk cost money he didn't have, about the cruel irony of finding millions while being literally days away from homelessness. What do I do? Document everything meticulously. Get professional appraisals. Report the find to the IRS as treasure trove income, which will be taxable but establishes legitimacy. Most importantly, don't touch the coins until we've established clear legal ownership and you have security measures in place. Over the next 3 months, Matthew navigated complexities he'd never imagined. Professional numismatists cataloged Walter's collection, confirming that some coins were extremely rare, that the total value exceeded even Gerald's conservative estimate. The IRS accepted the treasure trove classification, though the tax burden would be substantial. Security companies installed systems to protect the mill's hidden chamber until the coins could be properly secured. Emma adapted to their new reality with the resilience of children who'd learned to expect change. They moved into a section of the mill Matthew had made minimally safe, camping in what had been Walter's office while he figured out what came next. The gold remained hidden and secured, its presence known only to Gerald, the appraisers, and the security company whose discretion was ensured by substantial fees. But word leaked anyway, the way it always does in small towns. Within weeks, people started appearing at the mill. Some were legitimate, historians interested in Walter Pritchard's story, numismatists wanting to study the collection. Others were less welcome, treasure hunters who believed there must be more hidden, opportunists offering unsolicited partnership deals, even distant relatives of Walter's claiming they deserved shares of the find. The most persistent was a man named Charles Brennan, who claimed his grandfather had loaned Walter money in the 1960s that was never repaid. He arrived at the mill one afternoon with a lawyer and documents that looked official but proved, upon examination, to be fabricated. "Walter Pritchard died owing my family $30,000, Charles insisted, standing in the mill's yard with his lawyer hovering behind him. "Your gold discovery should settle that debt before you keep anything." Matthew had learned enough by then to recognize the attempt for what it was. If your grandfather had a legitimate claim, he could have filed it during estate settlement in 1974. He didn't, which suggests either the claim is false or he knew it wouldn't withstand scrutiny. "We're prepared to sue," the lawyer said, his tone suggesting this was routine intimidation. "Go ahead," Matthew replied, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. "I've got documentation of everything, professional appraisals, legal opinions from attorneys who specialize in treasure trove law. You file a frivolous suit, I'll countersue for harassment and legal fees." After they left, Emma appeared from where she'd been watching through a window. "Were those bad people?" "Just greedy people. They saw we found something valuable and wanted a piece without having earned it." Matthew knelt to her level. "This is going to happen more. People who think they deserve what we found, who'll try to pressure or intimidate us into sharing. But the gold is legally ours, and we're going to use it the way Walter wanted, better than he did." The decision about what to do with the wealth took months of careful thought. Matthew could have sold the coins immediately, taken the money and disappeared to somewhere easier, built a comfortable life far from Grantville and its complications. But Walter's letter echoed in his mind, "I hoarded when I should have invested in people." The mill itself required attention first. Environmental assessments revealed asbestos in lead paint, decades of industrial residue that needed proper remediation. Matthew hired specialists, spent over $1 million making the building safe, removing the toxic legacy of textile manufacturing while preserving the historic structure. As contaminated materials were removed and replaced, as testing showed the property returning to safe levels, Matthew felt something shift. This wasn't just spending money, it was honoring Walter Pritchard's trust, using his hidden fortune to restore what he'd built. The mill had sheltered the gold for 50 years. Now the gold would resurrect the mill. The transformation happened slowly, carefully, guided by preservation architects who understood historic industrial buildings. They repaired the roof section by section, replaced thousands of windows with period-appropriate materials, reinforced the structure while maintaining its character. The massive looms were cleaned and stabilized, preserved as artifacts of an era when American textile manufacturing had employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Emma's interest in the project deepened as she learned about what the mill had been. She discovered that textile work had been one of the few industries where women could earn wages comparable to men, that mills like Walter's had provided economic independence for generations of workers. She started researching textile history, interviewing elderly Grantville residents who'd worked at the mill, documenting stories that would have been lost without her careful attention. Mrs. Patterson said her mother worked here in the 50s, Emma reported one evening while they ate dinner in the increasingly comfortable apartment Matthew had built in the administrative section. She said Mr. Pritchard was strict but fair, that he paid a living wage when other mills were cutting costs. That people cried when the mill closed because they knew nothing else would replace those jobs. The community's response to the mill's restoration evolved slowly. Some people resented Matthew, saw him as an outsider who'd gotten lucky and was now flaunting wealth in a town that had been slowly dying for 50 years. Others were cautiously hopeful, wondered if the restored mill might bring something valuable back to Grantville beyond just one man's fortune. The breakthrough came when Matthew made his intentions clear. He wasn't creating a museum or converting the mill into luxury apartments. He was establishing a textile education center, a place where traditional manufacturing skills could be taught and preserved. Working with state universities and craft organizations, he developed programs teaching everything from traditional weaving to modern sustainable textile production. The first classes started 18 months after Matthew bought the mill, small groups of students learning on restored looms, studying techniques that had been common knowledge 70 years ago but had nearly disappeared. Some students were craftspeople wanting to understand traditional methods. Others were young people from Grantville and surrounding towns, drawn by the possibility of manufacturing jobs that might actually exist in their community. Thomas Patterson, whose grandmother had worked for Walter Pritchard, became the first local hire, managing the education programs with the kind of careful attention his family remembered from the mill's working days. "My grandmother would have loved this," Thomas said during the opening ceremony. Not just the building being saved, but the knowledge being passed on. Walter believed in teaching proper technique, in training workers who understood why quality mattered. Matthew kept Walter's hidden chamber largely as he'd found it, preserving the crates and ledgers as historical artifacts while the most valuable coins were secured in proper facilities. But he created a small museum in the administrative section, telling Walter's story and the mill's history, explaining how American textile manufacturing had risen and fallen and how traditional skills still had value in a world that had moved toward mass production. The gold sale was handled carefully over several years, working with numismatic auction houses to get maximum value without flooding the market. After taxes and the mill's restoration costs, Matthew still had enough wealth to never worry about rent or groceries or whether Emma could go to college. But he continued living modestly, investing the majority of the proceeds in the education programs and in a foundation dedicated to preserving America's industrial heritage. Emma flourished in ways Matthew could never have predicted when they'd arrived desperate and displaced. She became passionate about textile history, about the stories of workers whose names appeared in Walter's meticulous ledgers, about preserving knowledge before the last generation who'd practiced these skills died. She started an oral history project, recording interviews with former textile workers throughout the region, creating an archive that universities began citing in their own research. On a warm evening in late April, 3 years after Matthew had bought the mill at auction, Gerald Porter visited with news that felt like closure. Charles Brennan's lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice, the judge ruling that not only was the claim without merit but that Brennan had knowingly filed false documentation. He'd been ordered to pay Matthew's legal fees and had been referred to the state bar for potential prosecution. "That should be the end of it," Gerald said. "Word's gotten around that going after you legally is expensive and pointless. The opportunists have moved on to easier targets." After Gerald left, Matthew stood in the mill's main floor, looking at the restored looms that now served both educational and productive purposes. The center had started taking small contracts for custom textile work, high-quality goods made using traditional methods for clients who valued craftsmanship over cost. The income barely covered expenses, but that wasn't the point. The point was keeping knowledge alive, maintaining skills, honoring what Walter had built. Emma found him there, her arms full of research materials for the history project. "Mrs. Henderson gave me her mother's employment records from 1948 through 1963. Every paycheck stub, every performance review. Mr. Pritchard documented everything." Matthew looked at his daughter, seeing how the mill had shaped her, how finding Walter's gold had given her more than financial security, it had given her purpose, connection to something larger than herself. "You're becoming a historian." "I'm becoming someone who understands that what people built matters, even after the economic reasons for building it are gone." The mill employed 300 people for 80 years. That's 300 families who had wages and security because Mr. Pritchard built something that worked. She paused. He died alone though, never having taught anyone to run the mill after him. That's sad. But we're correcting that mistake. Teaching people now what he should have taught then. The years continued their steady progression. The education center grew, adding programs in sustainable textile production and small-scale manufacturing. Students who'd learned there started their own operations, creating a network of craftspeople who valued traditional methods adapted to modern ethics. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Walter's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. Matthew expanded his work beyond the mill, consulting with other communities trying to save historic industrial buildings. He used Walter's gold to fund preservation projects throughout the region, helping stabilize structures that represented eras when American manufacturing had employed millions. The foundation he'd established became known for thoughtful, sustainable approaches to industrial heritage. On a cool October morning, 5 years after buying the mill, Matthew received an unexpected letter. Rebecca, his ex-wife, writing to say she'd seen articles about the mill's restoration, had learned about the gold discovery through mutual acquaintances, wanted to acknowledge that leaving had been her biggest mistake. "I thought you'd fail," she wrote. "I saw the eviction notice and the job loss and decided I couldn't watch you struggle. I chose comfort over loyalty, and I've regretted it every day since. Emma deserves better than a mother who only wanted the easy parts of parenting. You deserve better than a partner who abandoned you when things got hard." Matthew read the letter twice, feeling surprisingly little beyond mild sadness. The man who'd been devastated by her leaving didn't exist anymore. He'd been transformed by the journey from desperation to discovery, by the choice to honor Walter's trust rather than simply cash out, by watching Emma grow into someone who understood that legacy was built through patient work rather than received as windfall. He showed Emma the letter, wanting her to have the choice about whether to reconnect with her mother. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "She left when we needed her," Emma said finally. "Finding the gold didn't change that. Building the mill didn't erase it. I'm glad she realizes she made a mistake, but I don't need her to be part of what we've built." The wisdom in his daughter's response, the clarity that came from having survived abandonment and emerged stronger, made Matthew's throat tight. "If you ever change your mind, I know. But some people are part of your story because they left, not because they stayed. Mom leaving taught me who Dad is when things are hard. That's valuable, even if it hurt." 10 years after buying the mill, Matthew stood in Walter Pritchard's restored office, now a working space rather than a ruin, looking out at the processing floor where students were learning traditional weaving techniques. The building hummed with purpose, alive in ways it hadn't been since the 1970s, serving a function Walter would have recognized even if the specifics had evolved. Emma was in college now, studying industrial history and historic preservation, but she came home regularly to teach workshops and continue her oral history project. She'd become the mill's historian, the keeper of stories about workers whose names appeared in ledgers but whose lives had been invisible to history until she'd chosen to make them visible. The gold was gone, sold and converted to programs in preservation and education. But its value remained, transformed from metal sitting uselessly in a chamber to knowledge being taught and buildings being saved and young people learning that some skills were worth preserving even when the economic systems that had sustained them were gone. Matthew thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about a hidden chamber and a cotton magnate's trust. He thought about the choice he'd made to stay and build rather than take the money and disappear, about the principle that some inheritances came with obligations beyond personal benefit. The mill stood as proof of that principle. Walter Pritchard had hoarded his wealth, had died without teaching anyone what he knew, had sealed away gold that did no good sitting in darkness. Matthew had taken that gold and invested it in people, in teaching, in preserving not just buildings but the knowledge that gave those buildings meaning. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you owned but what you built with what you'd been given, not hoarding resources but investing them in creating something that outlasted you. The mill would stand long after Matthew was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would honor Walter's inadvertent gift by correcting his intentional mistakes. As evening settled over Grantville and the education center's lights glowed warm against the darkening sky, Matthew felt the weight of 10 years settle into something like peace. Not satisfaction exactly, because there was always more work to do, always knowledge to preserve and skills to teach. But contentment with choices made and ground held, with a daughter who'd found purpose in a building that had found new life. The land kept its secrets still, the river flowing past as it had for millennia, the magnolia tree standing where Walter had buried his vault key, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had given what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful from desperate circumstances, and people stubborn enough to do the building. Emma called from downstairs, her voice carrying through the mill's restored spaces. "Dad, there's a journalist here from the Preservation Association. She wants to interview you about the restoration." Matthew headed down to meet her, walking through a building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 50 years, that had been reborn through the intersection of his desperation and Walter's hidden fortune. The mill breathed around him, alive with purpose, its toxic legacy cleaned away, its spaces filled with the sound of looms and teaching and knowledge being preserved. Walter Pritchard's gold had saved Matthew and Emma from immediate desperation, but the real treasure had been understanding what to build with salvation once you'd received it. The coins were gone, but what remained was more valuable: a functioning education center, preserved industrial heritage, knowledge being passed forward instead of dying with the last generation who'd practiced it. The mill stood as monument to the idea that some things were worth saving even when economics said otherwise, that heritage had value beyond profit, that desperate people stumbling into good fortune could use it to build something that honored both their need and the trust placed in whoever found wealth that had been hidden and waiting. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and cotton, in patient restoration and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear, in the understanding that true wealth lay not in gold sitting in darkness but in light being shared with those who came after. 15 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the mill the way water shapes stone. Matthew watched Emma grow from the 7-year-old girl who'd helped him find Walter Pritchard's hidden chamber to a 22-year-old woman whose hands bore ink stains from archival work and whose passion for preserving industrial heritage had shaped her into someone Walter would have recognized and valued. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you notice day by day. But when Matthew looked at photographs from that first desperate winter camping in Walter's office, he barely recognized the broken man and frightened child they'd been. The mill had transformed with them. What had been toxic abandonment was now thriving preservation, what had been decay was now purpose. The main processing floor operated again, not for mass production but for education and small-scale sustainable textile work. Students came from across the country to learn traditional weaving on looms Matthew had carefully restored, to study techniques that most of the modern world had forgotten existed. The building breathed differently now, alive with the sound of shuttles and conversation, the smell of natural fibers and fresh cotton replacing the mildew and decay that had defined it for 50 years. Emma had deferred college twice, choosing instead to build the mill's archive and oral history project, documenting not just Walter Pritchard's story but the lives of hundreds of workers whose names appeared in his meticulous ledgers but whose voices had been lost to time. She'd interviewed elderly Grantville residents who'd worked at the mill, had collected photographs and pay stubs and personal stories, had created a resource that universities were now citing in their research on American textile manufacturing. The gold and bonds had been liquidated carefully over the years, working with numismatic experts and financial advisors to maximize value while minimizing market disruption. After taxes and the mill's extensive restoration, Matthew had enough wealth to never worry about rent or groceries again, but he'd continued living modestly, investing the majority of proceeds in education programs in a foundation dedicated to preserving America's industrial heritage. The community's relationship with Matthew had evolved slowly, shaped by his decision to stay and build rather than sell and disappear. Some people never forgave him for refusing Morrison Development's offers, saw him as an outsider who'd gotten lucky and was now playing preservationist with money he didn't earn. But others gradually recognized that the mill's restoration had brought something valuable back to Grantville, not just jobs, though the education center employed local people, but pride and history that had been slowly eroding. Thomas Patterson, whose family had worked at the mill for 3 generations, had become the education center's director, managing programs with the same attention to quality his grandmother had learned from Walter Pritchard. "My family thought this building would be demolished," Thomas said during the mill's 10th anniversary celebration. "That everything it represented would be erased and replaced with generic development. Mr. Cole didn't just save bricks and mortar. He saved memory, kept alive knowledge that would have died without this preservation." Jennifer Morrison attended that celebration, older now, her hostility replaced by something approaching respect. She'd left Morrison Development years ago, had started her own firm focused on adaptive reuse rather than demolition. She approached Matthew during a quiet moment, her posture suggesting this conversation had been rehearsed. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "Not just for the threats and harassment, but for not seeing what you saw, that some buildings deserve preservation even when demolition is more profitable. Watching what you've built here changed how I approach my own work." Matthew accepted the apology with a nod, understanding that redemption came in many forms, that people could learn from their mistakes if they were willing to acknowledge them. Walter Pritchard taught me that through his letter. He hoarded when he should have invested in people, died alone when he should have been teaching. I just tried not to make his mistakes. On a warm evening in late spring, 20 years after Matthew had bought the mill at auction, he received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca appeared at the mill's entrance, older and carrying herself with the uncertain posture of someone who wasn't sure of her welcome. She'd reached out several times over the years, awkward letters acknowledging her abandonment, requests to see Emma that his daughter had politely declined. Emma saw her first, her expression going carefully neutral in the way it did when processing complicated emotions. "Should I talk to her?" "That's your choice, sweetheart. You don't owe her anything, but if you want closure, now's the time to get it." They met Rebecca in the mill's small museum, the space Emma had created documenting Walter's life and the building's history. Rebecca looked around with evident surprise at the transformation, at the thriving operation that had grown from Matthew's desperate gamble. "I've followed your work," Rebecca said, her voice directed at Emma. "The oral history project, the preservation advocacy, the articles you've published about industrial heritage. You've become remarkable." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her face showing the kind of careful control she developed over years of managing difficult emotions. "I became who I needed to be when you left. Dad showed me that standing for something matters more than comfort, that some things are worth the cost of defending them. You leaving taught me who I didn't want to become." The words were gentle but firm, acknowledging Rebecca's presence without absolving her abandonment. Rebecca nodded, tears in her eyes, understanding that some relationships couldn't be repaired, only acknowledged for what they'd been and what they'd cost. After she left, Matthew and Emma stood together in the museum that told Walter Pritchard's story, looking at photographs of workers long dead, at ledgers documenting wages paid and fabric produced, at the evidence of an industry that had employed millions and had then moved overseas in search of cheaper labor. "Do you think we did right by Mr. Pritchard?" Emma asked. "Using his gold the way we did?" Matthew thought about the question carefully, about the years of restoration and teaching, about the knowledge being preserved and passed forward. He died alone, his skills untaught, his building abandoned. We corrected those mistakes. The gold he hoarded became education, became preservation, became something that honors what he built while learning from what he failed to do. "Yeah, I think we did right by him." The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the mill's story. Students who'd learned traditional textile work there established their own operations, creating a network of craftspeople who valued sustainable methods and quality materials. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Walter's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. The foundation Matthew had established became known throughout the region for thoughtful approaches to industrial heritage preservation. They'd helped save dozens of buildings, mills and foundries and factories that represented eras when American manufacturing had been viable, when communities had grown around industries that promised stability across generations. Emma's work expanded beyond just the Riverside Cotton Mill. She consulted with museums developing industrial heritage exhibits, taught university courses on preservation methodology, published research that connected labor history to the physical spaces where that labor had occurred. She'd become an expert in her field, but she always returned to the mill, to the building that had shaped her understanding of what mattered. On a cool October morning, 25 years after buying the mill, Matthew stood in Walter Pritchard's restored office, now a working space rather than a ruin, looking out at the processing floor where students were learning to operate century-old looms. The building hummed with purpose, alive in ways it hadn't been since the 1970s, serving a function Walter would have recognized even if the specifics had evolved. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about a hidden chamber and a cotton magnate's trust. He thought about the choice he'd made to stay and build rather than take Morrison's money and disappear, about the principle that some inheritances came with obligations beyond personal benefit. The mill stood as proof of that principle. Walter Pritchard had hoarded his wealth, had died without teaching anyone what he knew, had sealed away a fortune that did no good sitting in darkness. Matthew had taken that fortune and invested it in people, in teaching, in preserving not just buildings but the knowledge that gave those buildings meaning. Emma appeared in the doorway, carrying coffee and the kind of smile that made her look like her mother in the good years, before everything had gotten hard. "There's a documentary crew here. They want to film the anniversary gathering next week, make it part of a series about American industrial heritage." "What did you tell them?" "That they're welcome as long as they understand this isn't about treasure hunting or get-rich stories. It's about preservation and education and honoring the people who built these places." She paused. "Is that okay?" Matthew nodded, recognizing that Emma had internalized the values he'd tried to teach, had made them her own through years of careful work. "That's perfect. Walter would approve." The anniversary gathering drew people from across the country, former students and current teachers, preservation specialists and labor historians, community members who'd watched the mill transform from ruin to resource. They toured the restored spaces, watched demonstrations of traditional textile work, examined the archives Emma had built documenting not just Walter's life but the lives of everyone who'd contributed to the mill's 82 years of operation. Thomas Patterson gave a speech about his grandmother, about working-class people whose labor had built America's industrial capacity, whose skills had been devalued and forgotten when manufacturing moved overseas. This building stands as monument to the idea that their work mattered, that what they knew deserves preservation even though the economic systems that sustain them are gone. Mr. Cole understood that when he chose to restore rather than demolish, to teach rather than simply profit. As evening settled over Grantville and the celebration wound down, Matthew walked alone through the mill's main floor, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had once been abandoned but now pulsed with purpose. He thought about Walter Pritchard, about a man who'd died protecting something he believed mattered, who'd hidden his fortune as a final act of faith that someone would come along who'd understand what was worth saving. That someone had been him, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd almost chosen the easier path of taking money and walking away. But he'd listened to a dead man's trust, had honored principles about craft and quality and refusing to surrender when powerful people demanded it. The mill would stand long after Matthew was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and cotton, in patient restoration and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear, in the understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before the mill was built, before Walter Pritchard had worked his final shift, before Matthew had placed his desperate bid, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved and families choosing to build rather than destroy. The mill stood in the darkness, its windows glowing warm with security lights, its brick walls holding stories that spanned generations. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 50 years, had been reborn through desperation meeting opportunity, through stubbornness meeting grace, through one man's hidden fortune meeting another man's willingness to honor the trust it represented. Matthew locked the building for the night and walked to the small house he'd built beside it, modest but solid, with Emma's archive workshop attached and student housing in the converted storage buildings. The property hummed with quiet activity even in evening stillness, alive in ways that honored Walter's vision while serving needs he couldn't have anticipated. The land kept its secrets still, the river flowing past as it had for millennia, the magnolia tree standing where Walter had buried his vault key, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had given what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful from desperate circumstances, and people stubborn enough to do the building. As dawn broke over Grantville the next morning, painting the mill's brick walls in shades of gold and amber, Matthew stood on the second-floor catwalk looking down at the processing floor where looms stood ready for another day of teaching and creating. Emma joined him, coffee in hand, both of them watching light transform the space the way it had transformed their lives. Walter Pritchard died believing his work might not matter to anyone, Emma said quietly. That everything he'd built would just disappear as if it never existed. But he was wrong, Matthew replied. His work mattered to you and the students who come here. It matters to a whole community of people keeping traditional skills alive. It matters because we chose to make it matter. The mill breathed around them, its restored mechanisms and preserved spaces holding the weight of history while serving present purpose. Walter's gold had saved Matthew and Emma from immediate desperation, but the real treasure had been understanding what to build with salvation once you'd received it. The coins were gone, converted to restoration and education and preservation. But what remained was more valuable, a functioning teaching center, preserved industrial heritage, knowledge being passed forward instead of dying with the last generation who'd practiced it. The mill stood as monument to the idea that some things were worth saving even when economics said otherwise, that heritage had value beyond profit, that desperate people stumbling into good fortune could use it to build something that honored both their need and the trust placed in whoever found wealth that had been hidden and waiting. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you chose to build with what you'd been given, not hoarding resources but investing them in creating something that outlasted you. The mill would stand, would teach, would preserve, long after Matthew and Emma were gone, a living testament to the principle that some battles were worth fighting even when powerful people wanted you to surrender. The morning light strengthened, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air above looms that would soon be working again, above students who'd learned skills most of the world had forgotten, above archives that preserved names and stories that would have been lost without Emma's patient documentation. The mill that Walter Pritchard had built, that Matthew Cole had saved, that Emma Cole would carry forward, stood ready for whatever came next. The land had held its secrets and then yielded them to someone worthy. Matthew had proven worthy not by finding them but by honoring the trust they represented, by building rather than simply consuming, by teaching rather than hoarding. And Emma would carry that forward, would ensure that Walter's inadvertent gift continued correcting his intentional mistakes for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.